Welcome. We are the Tulsa World Opinion section. I'm Ginnie Graham, the editorials editor.
I'm Bob Doucette, editorial writer.
And we're going to talk a little bit about a column that Bob did this week. And it has to do with the tornadoes that hit last week. And Bob, I'm just going to ask you, what inspired the column and what were the points you were making?
Well, I remember Friday night, I was just kind of going through Twitter just for time waster type of stuff as we do. And all of a sudden there's a guy who I know who lives in Kentucky now, and he was posting some photographs of a tornado that was plowing through that part of the country right then. Now, December tornadoes happen, but just looking at the pictures, it's like, oh my goodness, this is just a huge wedge tornado. We're seeing this happen in a wintertime month. So a lot of the fears was that was going to be a tremendously damaging tornado, and it was. And then as we got to learn more about what happened with this tornado outbreak, it was almost 24 tornadoes over 4 or 5 states. And this particular tornado, some people are thinking it may have been on the ground for over 200 miles. And something else that struck me too is how fast it was moving. And at times it was covering ground, somewhere around 100 miles per hour. And they had estimated that it was an F5 strength tornado. So it's having, 200 plus mile per hour winds in this massive cone of a storm. And it got me thinking back to the worst storm I ever saw back in 1999 in the Oklahoma City area. That one was on the ground for an hour and a half. It was moving a lot slower than what we saw in Kentucky, but it was $1 billion storm that did a tremendous amount of damage in a heavily populated area. 320 mile per hour winds, highest ever recorded. It was just one of those things that was just kind of mind-boggling. But that also happened during the heat of tornado season. It happened in early May, and that's what we have in this part of the country in the Great Plains. That's where we see the most severe weather occurring is, April, May, June. This was December. And that kind of struck me as not just odd, but we need to look into this a little bit more. And as I started reading some more things about it and researching it a little bit, we were seeing the fact that Tornado Alley, as we know it, looks to be shifting east. So it's following a pattern of warmer, wetter conditions that are happening in the eastern United States. On top of that, you're seeing other changes related to weather and climate that are occurring. Something that's called the Western Dry Line. Something I learned about a couple of years ago reading something else, where there's sort of a dividing line in the middle of a continent between the humid, wetter east and the drier west. And that dry line is moving slowly but surely further east across the Great Plains from Mexico all the way into the Canadian Arctic. And all of these things, plus, stronger, more intense hurricanes, extended wildfire seasons that are getting a lot more severe, prolonged drought. We're talking 3 decades across the Rocky Mountain West and the West Coast. These aren't just weather phenomena that are happening every now and then. They're showing patterns. And when you're talking about climate, you're looking at patterns, systemic patterns that occur. So what I'm seeing here is we are having some issues coming up with this. We are seeing more damaging storms. We're seeing more frequent and more intense coastal flooding. All of these things point towards something to where we got to get past this debate of, is this really occurring? Yes, it's happening. So the next thing is what are we going to do about it? And I think that that's a conversation that needs to be had at a high level policy making type of level, so to speak. I'm having trouble with words there, but cities and counties, the states and the federal government have to start talking about resiliency. We can't just let stuff like this happen with the systems that we have in place now, or we're going to continue to be ravaged by these changes. So we can basically ask ourselves, do we want to find a way to live within the system of our changing climate, or are we going to just continue getting smashed by it? And I would say from the experience that we had last February with that massive cold snap that we had, the outages that were experienced all across the South, particularly in Texas, and the cost that it's bringing up, not just to governments and power systems, but to people like you and me and everybody in our readership. We're all going to pay for that. But if this keeps happening again and again, something's got to give.
Well, and you mentioned resiliency, and for me, that definition has always been, about something bad happened and bouncing back. We're going to get back to where we started. But I think in this case, what you're talking about is not necessarily returning to the status quo, that we have to be resilient to move on, that in order to live our lives in the way that we're accustomed to, we're going to have to find a new way to live. That may be better construction. It may be doing things that we are no longer able to do, or just go about our daily lives in a different way. But I don't, like you were talking about the idea of, is climate change happening? I think right now we all agree it is, because the argument was always, oh, well, a cold temperature was set back in 1923, or a high on this day was back. You can always find these anomalies, but what you're talking about are these patterns now that we're seeing.
Yes.
New York is getting flooded and they don't have the infrastructure to have it. We saw with the tornadoes, they're hitting states that have never dealt with tornadoes to the degree that we have, and they certainly don't have the warning systems and that infrastructure. So the resiliency we're talking about, or I think you're talking about, is we're going to have to do some things different and better in order to survive. I mean, am I
yes
understanding that a little better?
Well, if you think about it,
I mean, to me, it's like, okay, so climate change is so huge to me, and I almost kind of wonder if this is the problem we've had. We're talking about global change. So what do we as individuals do? What are our responsibilities? What can I do? It seems small.
Ooh, boy, that's a good question. Because a lot of the stuff that people are being asked to do are ways to mitigate something like, throwing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's fine. That's great. It's good that we would start finding ways to capture carbon, start stemming that kind of a thing. And people are working on that at a very high level and at a very international level. But these are going to be the things that are going to help people down the road, probably after we're gone, because the changes that are occurring right now, they are not going to stop next year or 10 years from now or whatever. This is going to be the way things are for a while. So the difference between trying to make it better in the future and resiliency now is pretty stark. So as far as what an individual can do now, if you're going to build a home, for example, and you're going to be building it in a home that's a storm-prone area, you're going to want to look at things like a reinforced storm shelter. You're going to want to take a look at what your builders are thinking about doing in terms of how strong the house is constructed. If you're looking at moving somewhere, you're going to need to pay attention to things like how secure is their water system. If you're living out west, that's going to be a question, because a lot of the systems, a lot of the watersheds that provide large cities out west with the water that they need, they're drying up. If you're going to be living in a coastal area, pay attention to that, because places that are fine right now may not be fine in 10 years. They may be regularly hit by not just like storm surges, but just regular ocean surge, tidal surges that cause flooding and things like that. So these are going to be, and obviously from the individual standpoint too, you're going to be wanting to take a look at what policymakers are doing You know, we need to start asking people these questions. If you're down in Texas and you're talking to your elected officials, you need to ask them, what are you doing to protect our power grid? Because what happened last February in Texas is unacceptable. You can't have people freezing to death in Houston or Brownsville or San Antonio. That's ridiculous. You know, so you need to talk to those people. It's not acceptable to say we're going to go on the cheap because we just want to, and then run away to Cozumel when things get rough. Sorry, that doesn't cut it. So we need to demand a little bit more of our policymakers and really ask them, what are you doing locally? What are you doing as a state? What are you doing federally to help deal with this? Because these problems are not going to go away.
Well, the emergency preparedness, certainly it's taking on a new shape now, because our utility companies are now talking about, well, we're going to pay for the freeze from February over the course of 25 years or 28 years or whatever it is. Well, we're going to have another freeze or 2 or 20 while we're paying off one storm. So at this point forward, my concern is, how are we going to regulate and prepare for those energy needs when the next freeze happens or the next flood, tornado, whatever it is that disasters are coming? And that gets back to your resiliency, I think.
When you take a look at power grids in northern states and in northern countries, places that are north of us, they experience cold as severe or more so than what we saw in February. As hard to believe as that might be, it's true. But their power systems don't tend to go out like ours did, and certainly not like what happened in Texas. So it's not going to be a type of thing where you can't think of it in the average temperature in Austin is this, therefore we don't need that. Weather is becoming more unpredictable as the climate changes. We are seeing these extremes of, it's going to be a really hot summer, and that winter you might get blasted with -10. It might happen, and your systems, your power systems and whatnot, they have to be built in a way to withstand that. It's going to be more expensive, but it does beat the heck out of having to over and over again rack up basically what's turning into consumer utility debts, us paying off the damage from the past or paying for expensive spiking natural gas prices from, 1-2 week event. We can't keep doing that. So we're going to have to find a way to mitigate that in the future. It's going to be some tough conversations, but they have to happen. Otherwise, what are we going to be doing? Paying 100 years worth of debts for spiking natural gas costs from, another once in 100 years freeze that's now happening every 5 to 10 years. No, that's not acceptable.
Well, I found your column really interesting. It's very well written, and I hope that more Tulsa World readers can share it, and we'll continue that conversation. So I certainly appreciate it. Good job, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you.